Herzlich willkommen zu unserem heutigen Webinar live aus dem Energiestudio in Berlin. Wir wollen mit Ihnen heute über eine der zentralen Herausforderungen auf dem Weg zu einer klimaneutralen Energieversorgung sprechen, über Methanemissionen. Der Titel unserer Veranstaltung lautet Methane Emission in Focus from the USA to Europe. Vor allem wollen wir deswegen einen genaueren Blick auf die Methanemissionen werfen im Zusammenhang mit LNG aus den USA, unserem nach Norwegen wichtigsten deutschen Gaslieferanten. Und wir wollen diskutieren, welche Möglichkeiten und Chancen in diesem Bereich liegen. Methan ist neben CO2 eines der klimawirksamsten Treibhausgase. Es gilt als etwa 25 Mal klimaschädlicher als CO2 und Erdgas besteht hauptsächlich aus Methan. Methan entweicht aber nicht nur bei der Nutzung, bei der Verbrennung, sondern auch bei der Förderung und beim Transport, aber auch bei der Nutzung anderer fossiler Energieträger. Mein Name ist Charlie Grüneberg, ich leite die Kommunikation bei Zukunft Gas und ich darf Ihnen zunächst unsere Gäste vorstellen. Wir werden dieses Webinar heute zweisprachig durchführen. Unsere Referenten verstehen zum Teil Deutsch und sprechen zum Teil auch Deutsch, aber wir werden auch immer wieder ins Englische wechseln. A warm welcome to Christopher Goncalves. He is Chair and Managing Director Energy and Climate at Berkeley Research Group. Chris. Die Rolle der deutschen LNG-Importeure wird uns Tim Kehler darstellen, Vorstand von Zukunft Gas.
Hallo.
Und digital begrüßen wir Andreas Gut, Secretary General von Eurogas in Brüssel. Andreas wird uns über die EU-Methanregulierung berichten und welche Anforderungen sie an Gasimporteure stellt. Andreas, können Sie auch hören? Mich?
Hallo.
Ja, sehr schön. Die Veranstaltung wird aufgezeichnet und im Nachgang auf unserem YouTube-Kanal veröffentlicht. Wir senden Ihnen die Präsentation der Referenten und den Link zur Aufzeichnung später auch zu. Und wenn Sie Fragen haben, dann nutzen Sie gerne die Handhebefunktion oder schreiben Sie die Frage in den Chat. Zum Auftakt wird uns Christopher Goncalves einige Forschungsergebnisse zur Treibhausgasbilanz verschiedener fossiler Energieträger entlang der Wertschöpfungskette präsentieren. Chris, could you please start by briefly introducing your study on the comparison of the footprint of various fossil energy sources? You analyzed the emissions of methane and CO2 on the basis of the entire value chain from production to power generation in several international markets. So, Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Tim. Good to be here. Appreciate your time and thanks for your patience with me speaking English for the presentation. It's been a long time since I lived in Germany and my German's a little rusty. I am going to provide, I guess I would call it a sneak preview of some work we've been doing with a company or a group called LNG Allies for the LNG export community in the United States, evaluating the full cycle GHG footprint of natural gas and LNG as compared to competing fuels of pipeline gas delivered into Europe and Asia, as well as coal delivered into Asia. Just a quick disclaimer, this isn't any kind of client service product and our lawyers want to make sure that you can't sue us for what we say. Let me say just a quick word on the background and the approach that we've taken, since there are many studies coming out and there's a lot of different kinds of analysis out there. The first thing to say is that we're taking a systemic approach to the topic. That means we're analyzing major supply chains and corridors for the industry. We're not looking at individual supply chains of individual companies. Having said that, we're looking, trying to use as much as possible the best available information out there for actual measured data as opposed to emissions factors and estimates. That's very important because for those who know about life cycle analysis, you know that using factors and estimates is very common because the data is very much under development these days and it's very dynamic. So we've done a very thorough job, I think, to try to get the best available measured data that one can access. And I'll say more about that as we go. So we provide, by doing that, we provide a bottom-up analysis of the full supply chain for major supply routes and trade corridors to the destination markets. The analytics use a mass balance approach as the framework for quantifying and attributing GHG emissions to track and maintain a record of total emissions and their climate impact associated with each stage of the supply chain. That means production, processing, transport, transportation, shipping, and then final consumption or combustion of the LNG, the pipeline gas, and the coal that we're comparing to each other. As I said, we've consistently used the best available data sources that we've been able to access at the current time. We've been doing this now 3 years running with LNG Allies, so we're constantly improving the data sources as the data evolves in the industry. We're evaluating the GHG intensity of the supply chains based on a functional unit per megawatt hour. So we're measuring kilograms of the CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour of power generation in the end market. You can do it with any metric. You can do it with tons of steel. You can do it with MMBTUs of fuel. We're focusing on megawatt hours because we want to capture both the combustion and the full supply chain of the fuel. And also, of course, gas. The most common use of gas in Europe and many markets is for power generation. So it's probably the most relevant way to look at it. And then we normalize the CO2 equivalent impact of CH4 being methane or methane, on a GWP20 basis. So we're looking at the global warming potential on a 20-year basis. That means that the impact of methane is much greater in the short term than it would be if you measure it on a 100-year basis, say. So we're giving more impact, essentially, to the methane because of the urgency of the climate imperative. So just jumping straight to the results, and to qualify these results right up front, these are averages of everything we've done. So underneath these averages are highs and lows and a huge amount of data for all of these supply chains. I'm also not going into the detail of each route. For example, we've modeled the US LNG to Europe into Mid-Atlantic, Gulf Coast, and then South Texas. We've got 3 different supply zones feeding in. I'm averaging things here so we can show you simple results. So if you look at the chart on the left, which is the most relevant here, that's the one showing the averages to Europe. You see that LNG to Europe, on average, is just below 600 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour, with the methane built into those numbers. You can see the composition in terms of the upstream in dark blue, the midstream component in light blue, and then the downstream component being principally combustion for power generation in the yellow or orange bar. If you look next to that, you'll see the pipeline supplies to Europe. That's very equivalent, also just below 600 kilograms equivalent of CO2 per megawatt hour. Very similar kind of composition. A little bit less on the upstream, but a little bit more on the midstream. That has to do with the vintage of the legacy pipelines from, say, Algeria, from Russia, and some of the major supply corridors that have had quite a pretty famous amount of leaking, which has been detected by satellite. And then coal to Europe, again, a big average of all domestic coal production inside EU countries and the UK, as well as imported coal, all averaged together. And it shows the upstream, the midstream being very little, and then the combustion, of course, being huge because of the carbon intensity of coal-fired power generation. But you notice also the upstream is higher, and that's interesting because what we factored in is not just, you don't really have CO2 emissions from upstream. What you have is a lot of methane from coal mining, and we're capturing that methane from coal mining as well. I won't talk about the chart on the right to Asia, but we've also covered several Asian countries. I should have also said we cover about 15 markets worldwide, so we're measuring the largest LNG importing markets. Of course, we're not measuring every market. We want to find things that are relevant to LNG. So now let's drill down and focus on Germany for just a moment. So I'm pulling Germany out of those averages and now putting highlight on that. And what you find, what we found in general, is that coal and Russian pipeline supplies were among the more GHG intensive supplies considered for the full life cycle. And LNG and Norwegian pipeline gas supply were the best. The best of all is the Norwegian pipeline gas supply. The numbers are really quite good there. They're down all in for the full cycle or full supply chain, just below 400 kilograms per megawatt hour of CO2 equivalent. For US LNG to Germany, it's also still coming in around just under 600 kilograms per megawatt hour. Russian pipeline gas supply, I think it's just over 800, as you can see there, with the composition in the different colors, the same as before. And coal to Germany, including both domestically produced lignite and any imported coal, quite significant at almost approximately 1,200 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. Let's look at the same data a little bit differently, because I know the focus of everybody is on methane these days because of its climate impact in the short term. And what you can see is the significant composition of the CO2, but the role of methane in the light blue at the top. So Norway to Germany, there is a little sliver of methane, but it's really almost all the CO2 from power generation. Very light on the methane emissions, both upstream and midstream. US LNG to Germany, similar, but a more significant methane component. Russian pipeline gas to Germany, more methane component, but also higher CO2 equivalent. And then the coal to Germany, of course, quite significant. But you do see that big wedge of methane that mostly is coming from the upstream. One thing now to qualify even further the results, and I mentioned that the data is very dynamic and evolving very quickly these days, is the development of satellite tracking and measurement. So all of the data we've been working with so far is reported emissions by various parties, including in the shipping component, in the upstream component, monitors that have been keeping track around the world, the IEA and so forth, so that we can get consistent, as much as we can possibly achieve, get consistent data that is reported actual emissions. But it is bottom up, it's ground monitored and estimated. What we're seeing from satellite data is some indication that there's a risk that the reporting of methane is lower than it may actually be. And I say may because we don't know yet for sure. But if you look at the chart on the right, you can see for the Permian Basin, for the Uinta Basin, the Appalachian, and also there's a comparison there to South Caspian, another international area. You see that consistently, satellite tracking is indicating on a different metric that some of these production areas may have more methane, significantly more, 4 to 5 times more methane than has been reported and measured at the ground level. That needs to be qualified, though, because this is for entire production areas, including oil and other facilities. And the satellites, while they can have a pretty good resolution, don't have the ability to split oil wells, gas component from the oil component, or individual processing facilities and separation facilities and gathering and transportation facilities from each other. It captures a whole area of production, and splitting it out is very difficult. So this is kind of crude data that still needs to be processed to figure out which part is to be apportioned to the gas stream and which part goes to the oil stream or other sources. So there's a lot of work to do there, but that is coming, and there will be more information available in the future. Last point I want to make about this is if some of these basins around the world are being seen to have more methane than has been measured and reported at the ground level, it stands to reason that there would be the same effect from coal mines and from other sources of energy as well. This is just focusing on a few key places, but if you apply this to every source, then it's logical to assume that this will be a global problem experienced by the entire industry as well as coal.
Thanks a lot. I think some of the results were quite surprising. I have also one question in the chat, and I think it's would be quite good to let it in here. In the case of fossil fuels, not inconsiderable quantities originate from abandoned mines and wells. Your graphs only include up, mid, and downstream. Are these post-production emissions included in your analysis?
They're not included to the extent they're not in the reported data for production facilities. So that is a very significant issue, and the end-of-life management of wells is quite an important topic. You wouldn't obviously, though, ascribe an end-of-life well to a current production stream and delivery because it's not producing anything at all. So that's a serious issue, but in my mind, it's a different issue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, then we will switch to Brussels. Andreas, with its methane regulation, the EU wants to address the issue internationally. Producers and traders in the EU must submit to a strict control regime, but they must also provide information on methane emissions in the producing countries. Andreas will now give us a brief overview of the details of what will be required of trading partners in the future. So, Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation, and Christopher for the presentation of this very important work, and happy to provide a little bit of details on the upcoming methane emission requirements in Europe. And maybe just to give a brief overview about Eurogas. So we represent the European gas industry, so mid and downstream parts. So we are, of course, representing also European gas importers. Perhaps upfront, and just to make sure that this is very clearly understood, we fundamentally support the objectives of the EU methane emission regulation. It is really a cornerstone of the EU Fit for 55 legislative framework. And our concerns with regard to the regulation are not so much about the level of ambition that the regulation seeks to achieve, but how to comply with some of the requirements. So the level of uncertainty that is left open in the regulation and the practicability of some of the requirements is the thing that we're trying to address. Again, fully subscribing to the overall objective, and really to say that the issue of methane emissions it's absolutely necessary to tackle for the gas sector. But it comes at a particular point in time as well. And here, of course, very interested to hear the points of view from Christopher. It also comes at a time when Europe needs to diversify its gas resources. So we need to enable also pragmatically the contracting of new gas supplies in the coming years. And that, of course, requires us to look a little bit into the detail of the methane emission regulation and what it actually requires. And it's really not going to be easy to give a full overview and explain all the different details and challenges of the regulation in just 10 minutes, but to give you a brief overview of the main requirements with regard to importers. There are basically three stages. One is as of immediately, so as of entry into force, which is actually since August 24. Importers have to collect a number of data points about the gas that they import, the country of origin, the point of production, who is the exporter. It's a relatively straightforward list, but already here you start having some challenges in terms of the clarity of what is actually being required and how that data is supposed to be reported. Then progressively, these rules will become tighter and tighter. And just to say that the first reports, they cover all of the different gas that will be imported, whether that's new contracts or existing contracts. As we move on in time, the requirements will become stricter. And the next milestone really is the 1st of January 2027, when all new gas contracts or renewed gas contracts will have to demonstrate that at the point of production, the rules for MRV, so monitoring, reporting, and verification, are at least equivalent to those of the European Union standards. And again, these will then over time become progressively more strict. That will be followed by the necessity to report methane intensity of the gas imported. Again, this concerns new and renewed contract after entry into force. So anything signed or renewed after August 2024 will be subject to these requirements. And finally, last but not least, in August 2030, there will then be a methane intensity limit that applies to gas imported under contracts signed after that date. So after August 2030, a limit applies to the methane intensity for imported gas. So roughly, that's a couple of the important milestones. And now maybe just addressing two of the key issues that we have with the regulation. And I won't go into the text is quite long, and it has a few uncertainties and clarities, but these I would not consider necessarily to be the major bottleneck. They are problematic, certainly, but they can be clarified. And the Commission has, a couple of weeks ago, already published a question and answer document where they've attempted to provide some clarity on some of the open questions. So I won't address these. But what really is important is the question of MRV equivalence So there are a couple of ways that an European importer can demonstrate equivalence. It's either at European level, the European Commission defines that the third country from which the gas is being imported has equivalent rules in place, and that's going to be done through secondary legislation. Here, unfortunately, we don't have a date. We don't know when this legislation will come into effect and when the Commission will be finalizing negotiations with third countries, such as the United States, whether or not they will be determined equivalent. If this third country level equivalence is not granted, then you have to go to the actual producer level equivalence. So as a European importer, you have to demonstrate that the point of production of the natural gas, the rules are equivalent. And that really becomes a key challenge for certain markets, and in particular in the United States, where as soon as you have complex value chains, or you have you purchase gas on third country trading hubs, you lose the ability to identify the origin, the original point of production of the gas. So it becomes extremely challenging to demonstrate that at that point the rules have been equivalent. And that really is one of the major stumbling blocks that we are trying to address and come up with ways to actually certify throughout the entire value chain the, let's say, environmental attributes of the natural gas that we import, so that European importers actually have a means to comply with the upcoming requirements. And last point I would like to raise is also some of the upcoming challenges in relation to the methane intensity standard that will be set. It's important to understand that we will have a methodology for those methane intensity calculations to be provided by the European Commission only in 2028, if I'm not mistaken. And the reports have to be delivered then the following year in 29. I'm sorry. So the methane intensity reporting has to start in 2028. The obligation to achieve a certain limit then therefore doesn't leave a lot of time for the value chain to actually make the necessary adaptation. So it's a question, of course, what kind of level you can realistically set for future methane intensity standards when you only have about a year between knowing that level that you need to reach and the ability then to make adaptations to your processes. So there are also some upcoming challenges, but they're a little bit further into the future. At this point in time, really the key question for us is MRV equivalence, how that will be defined. Who will define it? Because in the end, it's up to each individual member state to determine what is equivalent rules if it's not defined by the European Commission. And then how to trace environmental attributes throughout the natural gas value chains up to the point of import. So, Tim, I think I'll leave it with that and happy to take some questions later on.
Mhm. Okay, thank you, Andreas. Damit wollen wir auch in die Diskussion starten und auch Sie, liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer, können gerne Ihre Fragen stellen, ob auf Englisch oder Deutsch, das steht Ihnen frei. Nutzen Sie auch gerne den Chat oder die Handhebelfunktion. Tim, wie ist deine Einschätzung? Was bedeutet diese EU-Methanregulierung für Deutschland und wird sie sich auch als sinnvolles Instrument erweisen oder konzentriert sie sich ähnlich wie viele Diskussionen in Europa zu sehr auf Gas und weniger auf andere fossile Brennstoffe?
Ich glaube, vorneweg ist erstmal zu unterstreichen, gut und wichtig zu unterstreichen, das, was Andreas auch gerade sagte, die Methanregulierung ist ein ganz wichtiger Schritt, um auch Transparenz hineinzubringen, um diese Emissionen, die ja neben den CO2-Emissionen aus der Verbrennung entsteht, auch in den Griff zu kriegen. Die Relevanz der Methanemissionen hat ja Christopher auch bereits schon beschrieben. Der Hebel, den Methan nun mal hat, ist sehr groß. Gerade wenn man das auf den 20-Jahres-Zyklus bezieht, der auch den Analysen zugrunde liegt, ist das natürlich ein wesentlicher Treiber für den Klimawandel, den wir erleben. Deswegen ist es gut und richtig, dass diese Regulierung eingeführt ist, die ja auf zwei Richtungen auch schaut. Das eine ist, man schafft Transparenz in den Lieferketten, dass man auch weiß, wie sieht die Vorkette aus des Gases, was nach Europa gebracht wird. Andreas hatte die verschiedenen Stufen, in der das jetzt auch eingeführt wird, auch präsentiert. Es wird erstmal Transparenz geschafft, dann gibt es eine Phase, die sich so schön auch als Naming and Shaming beschreiben lässt. Also es wird auch öffentlich gemacht, wer ist wie gut. Und dann soll ja auch tatsächlich sehr konkret in den Verträgen, in den Gaslieferverträgen festgeschrieben werden, welche Grenzwerte einzuhalten sind. Also die Branche, die ja sehr importorientiert ist, bewegt sich sehr klar in einen Korridor hinein, der in Richtung Null Emissionen auch sich bewegt. Ich würde aber gerne auch nochmal den Blick auf das Inland lenken. Also die Methanregulierung steckt ja auch ein Rahmen für alle, die innerhalb der Europäischen Union oder in Deutschland mit Gas auch zu tun haben. Die Netzbetreiber sind durch die Methanregulierung verpflichtet, regelmäßige Messungen auch nachzuweisen, Transparenz zu schaffen, was in den Leitungen auch passiert. Damit auch diese Seite, die auch einen Beitrag trägt, aber wir haben es auch gerade gesehen an der Analyse von BRG, einen kleinen Beitrag leistet, dass man das auch weiter noch reduziert. Und da können wir sagen, das zeigen auch Messungen, die jetzt auch vom Umweltbundesamt in das nationale Emissionsinventar auch übertragen werden, dass Deutschland dort große Fortschritte gemacht hat. 40% Methanreduktion wurde erreicht seit 1990. Obwohl das Gasnetz deutlich gewachsen ist seitdem. Das kann man auch sehr gut erklären, wie das passiert ist. Wir sehen an vielen Stellen, dass gasbetriebene Kompressoren durch elektrische ersetzt wurden und vor allen Dingen aber auch im Wesentlichen die Leitungen von Grauguss, was durchaus anfällig ist gegen Unfälle und Leckagen, ersetzt wurde durch Polyethylen, ein sehr dichtes Material, weshalb wir im Übrigen auch sehr sicher sind, dass das Verteilnetz auch wasserstofffähig ist. Ein sehr dichtes Material, was eben auch zu einer sehr erheblichen Senkung der Methanemissionen geführt hat. Wir sagen aktuell, dass die Methanemissionen der Gaswirtschaft einige wenige Prozentpunkte der gesamten deutschen Methanemissionen auch ausmachen. Und das vielleicht zum Abschluss nochmal ist auch ein ganz wichtiger Punkt, der für die Debatte ganz zentral ist. Wir dürfen nicht dem intellektuellen Kurzschluss unterliegen, dass wir sagen, Erdgas ist Methan und deswegen sind alle Methanemissionen auf das Erdgas zurückzurechnen. Die Diskussion erleben wir gerne und oft. Da ist es, glaube ich, sehr wichtig, dass man sich nochmal der gesamten Proportionen der Methanemissionen auch bewusst wird. Die Hauptmethanemittenten sind Landwirtschaft, also Vergehren von verrotteten Biomassen, Gülle und Ähnliches, das sind Greisfelder, das sind die Hauptmethanquellen auf diesem Planeten, gefolgt von Abfall. Auch dort verrottet etwas, auch dort entsteht Methan. Das sind die beiden ganz großen Blöcke, die fast 70%, 75% der Methanemissionen global ausmachen. Und dann haben wir natürlich den Bereich der fossilen Energieerzeugung. Dort steht tatsächlich die Kohle an erster Stelle, gefolgt von Öl und von Gas. Und glaube ich, das ist auch für die Diskussion, die wir in Deutschland führen, wo Braunkohle ein ganz zentrales Element auch unserer Stromerzeugung ist, dass wir den Blick lenken auch auf die Methanemissionen, die bei der Kohle und bei der Ölförderung und auf Nutzung entstehen. Und dass wir das komplette Bild auch haben und das dann ergänzen können durch das, was wir bei uns in der Gaswirtschaft auch sehen und gestalten können. Und ich denke, die Tatsache, dass wir heute auch so klar und so transparent sprechen, zeigt, wir haben hier eine Verantwortung, wir nehmen das ernst. Und ich würde mich sehr freuen, wenn wir auch solche Diskussionen auch an anderer Stelle sehen würden.
Chris, in the chat we have a question about a new study showing that emissions of fossil gas is 4 times higher than estimated, and there are also other studies that show a significantly larger greenhouse gas footprint for LNG. What is your view on these studies? I don't know if you know all of them, but yeah, what is your view?
I guess I could speak in general. We've seen several of them. I'm not sure I know the exact ones that you're referring to, but well, I think my last slide addressed something at least related to that first study you mentioned, which is that oil and gas production methane emissions may be 4 to 5 times higher. That's in fact the chart that I put at the end. That's coming, a lot of that from satellite data, also sometimes environmental groups using different monitors and studying fields out in the field have indicated that they're seeing, big plumes or emissions that aren't being reported or measured by ground level sensors. So if that's true, the data will come out eventually. And I think if that's true for methane in some fields, it's going to be true for methane in most fields. I mean, I think, I'm just thinking back in time, we've been measuring CO2 for a couple decades seriously, and we've only really been measuring methane for the last 4 or 5 years seriously. So the quality of monitoring and measurement and information is very dynamic right now. So I think we will find out. I mean, I think that's the risk that I wanted to point out, is that it's a serious problem, and the world is really trying to get its mind around exactly what the data are. I do think satellites will help with that, but it creates the problem of how do you apportion, I think as Tim was mentioning, how do you apportion between oil and gas and the different kinds of process facilities? So I don't know if that answers that question. The other one you mentioned was regarding LNG being worse than coal. Was that the second one you mentioned? So there's a couple studies like that, one in particular, I think that's getting a lot of attention. The major difference between that study and ours is that it doesn't measure the combustion part of the chain. So it's looking at fuels on a volume basis compared to each other, but it's not measuring the final combustion component. That is the biggest difference. When you factor in combustion, where coal is over 2 times more CO2 intensive, and also when you focus on CO2 and methane combined, which is really what matters, it doesn't matter just one or the other. You have to look at them both. Then you get the results that we get. So we're really trying to understand the whole picture of both CO2 and methane all the way through combustion. So we understand the whole cycle of a fuel's footprint in society. That's, I think, the important distinction. It is true, though, if you look at just methane, or if you look at just CO2 and methane up to one point and don't factor combustion, you of course get a different result. There's other things that are more technical and detailed that I know to be differences. For example, we're industry experts. We measure all of the shipments. Our last data that I gave on the slideshow was 2023. We looked at all the shipments of LNG from 2023, and we applied information on methane emissions from actual measurements conducted by UT Austin for specific kinds of ships. So we took the actual measurements and applied them to the actual shipments. Other studies are just using factors and estimates based on scientific calculations of kinds of technology. So they're making much more rough estimates. And that same issue applies to some of the upstream. It applies to some of the power generation. As industry experts, we've looked at the heat rate, the average heat rates of coal generators and gas generators in all of the markets we've studied. And we've gone to the point of trying to understand which are the marginal units that are in play in the market, so that we're getting closer, not 100% accurate, but closer to what is the actual trade-off between burning more gas and burning more coal. And that's quite important because other folks are using just more general factors about types of technology applied globally. Well, that doesn't capture the vintage of coal-fired generators in Asia as compared to Europe, the quality or the energy efficiency of the generation technology. We're trying to get that kind of information into our study.
Tim, vielleicht ergänze ich da nochmal auch die deutsche Perspektive. Ich glaube, das ist ein ganz wichtiger Punkt, den Chris gerade macht, dass man natürlich auch, wenn man sich anschaut, Stromerzeugung, dass man den Wirkungsgrad, die Effizienz der Kraftwerke auch mit berücksichtigt. Hier gibt es sehr transparente Daten des Umweltbundesamtes in Deutschland, die regelmäßig den Wirkungsgrad auch unserer Kraftwerksflotte auch darstellen. In diesen Tagen, wo es vergleichsweise dunkel und wenig Wind ist, läuft sehr viel Kohle in der Stromerzeugung. Im Durchschnitt haben die deutschen Braunkohlekraftwerke einen Wirkungsgrad von 36%. Die Gaskraftwerksflotte hat einen durchschnittlichen Wirkungsgrad von über 60%. Also wir müssen an der Stelle wirklich auch sicherstellen, dass dieser Faktor auch eine Rolle spielt. wenn wir über die ganz wichtige Frage auch unserer Klimabilanz nachdenken, nämlich des Kohleausstiegs. Wer sagt, Gas wäre schlechter als Kohle, zementiert im Prinzip die Braunkohle in Deutschland, führt zu einem Lock-in in Braunkohle. Die Frage ist, ob wir das wollen. Es würde zumindest die Klimaschutzpolitik der letzten Jahre doch sehr deutlich hinterfragen.
Vielen Dank. The next question, I think it's for Andreas, but Christopher may also add some points. What are the estimated additional costs for importers to demonstrate their gas has been produced, processed and transported according to the EU Methane Act? And will these additional costs pose a supply security challenge for Europe?
That's a very relevant question, and maybe just a brief clarification to start with, and apologies if that wasn't clear in my intervention. But the requirements apply at the level of production. There are no requirements further down the value chain to demonstrate MRV equivalents, for example, at the point of export liquefaction or so on. So it's really, we're looking at the production well. When it comes to costs, I think what is more relevant here to consider in terms of security of supply or our diversification challenges is the additional uncertainty that these rules introduce into already complex contract negotiations. And what we are seeing today is indeed that negotiations for new deliveries of gas destined to Europe are being made extremely complex to the point that some of them apparently do not materialize, especially because the liability question around who is liable in case of inability to demonstrate MRV equivalents or an inability to demonstrate the point of production. These are questions that are still not answered, and that makes these negotiations extremely challenging because it's impossible to price in that uncertainty at the moment. So that really is the key challenge, much more than the question of additional cost for imports. I think that's not something I would be able to comment on, but it's really the uncertainty that the legislation adds.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you can add something, Christopher?
Well, perhaps just from discussions at a recent conference about these issues, that some of these uncertainties, I guess I would expect to be resolved over time. I mean, it's common with respect to the EU, they're wrestling with all the same data and information problems we're all wrestling with in the industry. And so as data gets better, as more companies are reporting, it stands to reason that they'll be able to fill in the supply chain and sort of complete the picture. I'm not making a prediction of what the EU will do. I know that I've been informed that they're trying to focus on the biggest component of production where you get the biggest impact. But of course, what really matters for the GHG impact, for climate change itself, is all of the information for all of the supply chain. So I would just expect the evolution of these kinds of regulations to be toward full supply chain over the longer term. There's other, I think, concerns about the EU regulation with respect to some of the things that Andreas mentioned, which is that you first have to start demonstrating equivalence and complying, but the actual metrics will come several years later. So you don't really know what you're complying with, but you have to start showing some sort of program. I think that's confusing a lot of people right now as how to go about that. So I would expect that, in the future, those are the kinds of gaps they'll try to resolve in future efforts. But those are the challenges of, for everyone in dealing with this uncertain environment where the information is evolving year in, year out.
Ich denke, wir sollten das auch nochmal auseinandernehmen zwischen Kosten und Preisen. Also ich denke mal, die Kosten, Transparenz herzustellen und auch die Sachen anzugehen, die sind verkraftbar innerhalb eines ökonomischen Systems, wie wir es haben. Die Frage ist, welcher Wettbewerb ist da? Wenn wir jetzt mit Handelspartnern Vereinbarungen treffen über geringe Methan, reduzieren wir letztendlich unsere Auswahlmöglichkeiten innerhalb des Marktes, weil viele Akteure da draußen sich nicht unbedingt auf dieses Thema einlassen wollen. Und je enger und je strenger wir eine solche Regulatorik auch im Sinne von Bürokratie aufbauen, desto stärker wird der Markt limitiert und desto höher werden die Preise für uns, weil wir einfach wenig Wettbewerb im Markt haben, um Methan, was im Rahmen der EU-Methanregulierung auch geliefert werden muss. Deswegen ist diese Diskussion, die Andreas gut anstrengt, auch extrem wichtig, dass wir es schaffen, einen Standard zu setzen, der verbindlich ist, der aber auch so ist, dass Lieferländer, die jetzt nicht unbedingt der Europäischen Union angehören, dann auch diesem Thema auch entsprechen können. Also gerade in der komplexen Situation der US-Gaslieferkette ist das extrem wichtig. Die US-Produzenten sind in einer ganz anderen Struktur unterwegs, als wir es hier in Europa kennen. Von daher ist ein einfaches Ausrollen der Idee, wie sie jetzt in Brüssel definiert wurde, auf den amerikanischen Markt schlichtweg nicht machbar. Und das ist genau das, was wir mit dieser MRV-Equivalence auch bezeichnen, dass hier eine Anrechnung der ohnehin passierenden Transparenzdaten der USA, und es gibt strikte Methanregulierungen in den USA, auch dann vermittelt werden kann, damit wir auch das volle Potenzial des Marktes ausnutzen können.
That brings me to another point, Christopher. What I learned these days at the LNG summit, and what many of us in Germany, also Europe, are probably not even aware of, is how fragmented the US gas market is and how many companies, some of them very small, are active there. Can you explain this to us again, and what impact it will have on possible implementation of an EU methane guideline?
Yeah, I thought that was an excellent point that Andreas made and that you're raising now. Because in fact, as compared to the EU or other markets around the world, I think of Japan or more, concentrated markets with fewer players. The United States production, since unbundling of the industry, where production was broken from transportation, from consumption, vertical integration was broken down, and competition at each stage of the supply chain was fostered, we have a wide array of players across all segments of the industry or all segments of the supply chain. And in fact, it's obviously famous that the shale gas revolution has driven huge amounts of production increase. I mean, we've gone from, in the course of my career, over 3 decades involving, energy sector, we've gone from, I think, approximately 60 billion cubic feet per day market to over 100. So we've increased production by 66%. And in doing that, we've shifted from all conventional since before 2010, almost all conventional, to now 80% or more shale gas, unconventional. Shale gas is produced by small independent companies, lots and lots of small companies. There are some very big ones, and of course the oil majors have also gotten into that recently, but there's just not that much concentration there. So it's a technology that involves lots of small wells and lots of independent players. And it's just a whole different challenge to sort of regulate and oversee that as compared to the way it works here in the EU. One point to make, though, on the point of competition that you were referring to earlier, is that it's not only the EU that is driving, and it's not only EU customers that are driving the demand for better MRV and measurement in the US and around the world, but also inside the United States. I read a statistic that I think almost 30%, over 25% of gas is sold inside the domestic market on what's called an RSG, or responsibly sourced gas basis. In other words, where you have MRV behind the sale. There's a lot of end states, progressive end states in the United States. I mean, obviously blue states, California, the Northeast, et cetera, that are demanding this. And so you have a lot of gas sales already inside the United States being transacted on this basis. Now you have big end markets, the EU, probably soon Japan, being the number 2 LNG market in the world, starting to require this and talk about standards. I think it's natural that producers want to compete. They want to get the best value for their product they can, and they see these standards growing around the world and inside the country. I think it stands to reason they're going to be looking at this not just as a compliance problem or a fee avoidance problem, but also a market competitiveness and value opportunity. And that's quite an important point.
Here's another question that shows, I think, a kind of misunderstanding. it's regarding the calculating of the combustion in the process. And the question is, if we calculate the combustion in, wouldn't gas or LNG become even dirtier than coal? But I think it's what you explained why this is not, but I think we have to explain it once again. Why does it not make a negative role for the LNG status if we...
Without reference to specific, what we call heat rates or efficiency levels in the German power plants, but talking more generally worldwide, I think the simple point, there's two simple points. One, when you burn a unit of coal, you get more emissions because of the carbon content in the coal. So that's one simple point. The other point, though, is the efficiency of the unit. A lot of gas plants have been built since, really a lot of them during my career, because I've been living through the independent power production boom where we built combined cycle plants all over the world, especially United States, EU, Northeast Asia, but all over Latin America and really all over the world. And those plants are newer, typically. The coal fleets were built, with exception of some newer plants in Asia. A lot of the coal fleet in Europe and the United States was built decades ago, if not even longer than that. And they were less efficient at that point in time, plus the efficiency degrades over time as the units get older. So what does that mean about efficiency? What that means is for every thermal unit of energy, say 1 million British thermal units of fuel that you put in, you get less kilowatt hours out. Or another way to say it is, for 1 kilowatt hour, you need more fuel. You need to burn more to get the same kilowatt hour. With gas, you need to burn less fuel to get the same kilowatt hour. And then so it's those two factors combined.
And maybe also the question addresses the issue of incomplete combustion in specific areas. Vielleicht dazu auch noch ein, zwei Sätze. Also natürlich kann bei unvollständiger Verbrennung auch immer noch Methan, also in einem Erdgasmotor, in einer Erdgasturbine Methan entweichen. In Kraftwerken ist das kein Thema, da haben wir vollständige Verbrennungssituationen, genauso wie in Gasboilern in Deutschland. Das ist im Ausland mit älteren Geräten möglicherweise etwas anderes, aber unsere deutschen Messungen zeigen, dass hier vollständige Verbrennung angelegt wird. Wir haben in Gasmotoren eine Diskussion über dieses Element. Da verweise ich aber sehr klar auf die, beispielsweise auch auf die CO2 bzw. Treibhausgas Elemente Zertifizierung im Biogasbereich. CO2-Reduktion, also Treibhausgasreduktion, ist ja die zentrale Größe im Biogasbereich. Dort werden alle Methanemissionen auch mit eingerechnet, inklusive der Sachen, die auch jetzt in den Motoren passieren. Neue Motorenstandards führen dazu, dass auch dieser Teil der Emissionen noch angegangen wird. Also ich will nur zusammenfassend sagen, alle Aspekte der Methanemissionen werden reduziert und sind im Fokus.
Another question for Andreas once again. Okay, we know it's difficult to talk about the additional costs because at the moment it's insecurity, what the problem is. But are there any discussions about cross-border adjustment for fair competition and climate protection in Brussels regarding methane emission or regarding the regulation?
I'm honestly not entirely sure if I understand the question correctly, but from our point of view, one of the, let's say, low-hanging fruits to solve a lot of the uncertainties would be to provide the market with the right tools to enable the demonstration of environmental attributes of natural gas throughout the value chain. And it's really something important that Christopher mentioned. I mean, we have, there's initiatives in the United States that require low emission gas. You have now the EU methane emission regulation. Japan might be following suit with equally ambitious legislation. We also have other requirements in Europe. For instance, when we look forward to produce low carbon hydrogen in the future, you will actually have to demonstrate the upstream emissions of natural gas EU have environmental sustainability reporting requirements. All of this coming together means that there's going to be increasing drivers for low emission gas. So there will be financial rewards for the best performers. Creating a certification system that is tradable and compatible with the global gas market and how it functions is really the best way to enable this market to pick up. And I think that's something that's really, really important that we start to think about and work towards. Again, not only to enable compliance with the methane emission regulation, but with everything else that is happening in Europe around transparency and reporting, but also globally. Mm-hmm. Now, I have to be honest, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it comes close.
Yeah, let me take another point regarding supply security and if and how this could be a challenge for Europe. Because US LNG suppliers, they don't have to work with Europe if they don't want. They also can export their product to Asia. In your opinion, would they take note of the EU regulation, or is there also the possibility that they say, sorry, it's too complicated for us, let's go to Asia?
That is a very provocative and interesting question. And it's very timely also because I think there was a lot of news over the last few days that some of the leading voices in Qatar have indicated that the Qataris may do just that. And they're not referring specifically to the methane regulation, but they're referring to, I think, generally, an alleged EU regulatory overreach. And there could be those kinds of impacts. But let's think just logically about the market on that. That would mean if Qatar didn't sell its LNG, its very large industry-leading amounts of LNG to Europe at all, that it would then have to sell all of it to Asia. Well, it can't be the case that both the Qataris and the US sell all of their LNG to Asia because there's just not enough demand in Asia. We have Indian demand picking up, but from a very small base. Chinese demand apparently slowing down quite a bit and maybe even further challenged in the future if we're going to have some sort of, administration-induced trade wars or something like that. So there's real question marks about where there is enough demand. I think it doesn't make sense that parties are going to pull supplies and send them to other regions just because of regulations. Just the same, I don't think it's going to maximize energy security in Europe to have confusing and difficult regulations. So one would hope that there would be, logical regulation and that producers will find ways to comply, but also to compete. And I want to go back to that point about the market and competition, because I think one thing that is very true of the US gas industry is an industry increasingly characterized by innovation and creativity. And I think that's one of the benefits of the deregulated US system that has fostered this kind of innovation. These are very competitive people who want to sell, they want to compete, and they want to win, and they want to create value. They want to add value and create value and profit from it. So I think if there is an opportunity, back to Andreas's point about creating more global standards or global integrated standards that give, I think what those kind of investors and producers like is certainty and consistency so they can make their plans, achieve their goals, and then compete effectively. When there's a hodgepodge of regulations or unclear and uncertain regulations, it frustrates them. But if they can see the clear path to define their product, improve their product, and win market and also charge premium prices or defend value, whichever way you want to look at it, I think that's something that the US industry will be very good at.
Mm-hmm. You just gave me the answer for my next question, but maybe you maybe add something, or if not, I'm sure Andreas and Tim will add something, or I'm interested in their point on this. How can this EU methane regulation become something like an international gold standard for methane regulation? Who will start?
Well, it takes two to tango. Right now we have a regulation from the EU that shall be imposed on our exporting partners. unless they agree to the standard, I think there's no basis to create it. On the other side, that's the big potential that we see if we align things between EU and the US to create a common standard that can be applied also elsewhere. But right now the situation is, as we are not achieving this equivalence issue, that from the US perspective is being perceived, EU wants to impose something on a system that is not compatible with this kind of thinking. And we should be very clear to put it in a more geostrategic perspective. President-elect Trump wants to solve the Ukraine issue very soon, he wants to make this as a top priority. And I would be surprised if LNG exports to Europe wouldn't be part of whatever deal Trump wants to develop with the Europeans, with the national states and the Commission. So we should rather be interested also from this geostrategic perspective to create a standard that is being accepted by our partners and not connected with the feeling that we want to impose something on someone.
Mm-hmm.
If I could add, I think I find it very difficult to answer a question about gold standard in the environment we're in because of the things I've said about data and the evolving nature of measurement, monitoring, verification inside the United States, but really around the world. I mean, there's so much inconsistency right now. We're so much in the early days of learning how to measure, monitor, verify, abate, and regulate, that it's just hard to think about what a gold standard would look like right now. I would just put out that I think having consistency and clarity will count for a lot, and being as complete as one can about a supply chain, which is to truly understand the climate impact of all of the business, all the way through combustion, is quite good. I also believe, as you probably can gather from my comments, that carrots are more powerful than sticks. And so if regulation leads to incentives, and I'm referring to, for example, in the United States, we moved from cost of service kind of regulation to performance-based regulation, where performance was rewarded with higher returns, and underperformance had the opposite effect. That was quite compelling for a lot of people in the industry and quite motivating. And so I think if you can find solutions like that that create incentives and opportunities and value in the competitive business, that will be quite motivating.
Mm-hmm. Andreas, what do you think could be an interesting point or interesting points to make the EU methane regulation to something like an international gold standard?
I'm also not sure if I would use that terminology. On the other hand, I think the legislation has already achieved one of its key objectives, and that is that today everybody's talking about it. I haven't been at a single conference where the gas industry was discussing current issues where methane emissions wasn't brought up. So it really is a hot topic, and there's a lot of innovation in this sector. A lot is happening, not just in Europe, but around the world. And I think that's one of the key deliverables of the regulation. So I think in that sense, it is delivering positive change. But also taking up one of the points that I think Tim made, it's really difficult to conceive a situation where Europe is acting entirely on its own. I think cooperation globally across countries is generally preferable than trying to impose certain standards from a European perspective on third countries. I think that's going to be a major challenge and lead to opposition. So cooperation, I think, is more likely to deliver fruitful results here.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very interesting discussion in the last hour we had, and I think we learned again a lot about methane emissions and what we can do in an international way with clarity and collaboration. Vielen Dank auch an Sie, liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer, für Ihr Interesse und Ihre Fragen. Thank you, Chris, once again for your time here, and I hope you enjoyed your stay in Berlin. Vielen Dank auch Andreas nach Brüssel für die Zeit und natürlich auch dir, Tim. Die Präsentation senden wir Ihnen im Nachgang zu dieser Veranstaltung zu. Eine Aufzeichnung finden Sie auch zeitnah auf unserem YouTube-Kanal. Uns können Sie in diesem Jahr noch einmal sehen, nämlich am kommenden Montag werden wir uns wieder einem internationalen Thema widmen, den grenzüberschreitenden Korridoren für Wasserstoff, also den Pipeline-Projekten aus Südeuropa. Ich wünsche Ihnen weiterhin eine erfolgreiche Woche und einen friedlichen 3. Advent und bleiben Sie gesund.